Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is John Cockburn-Evans and Debbie Russell. We're experienced coaches and consultants in the area of cultural transformation and change management. We're here to talk today about the first topic in our leadership series, the importance of matching expectations with success and some of the problems surrounding these. We're going to have an informal discussion which hopefully provides some insights on the topic. One of the triggers we both had for this topic was our respective coaching experiences, where we have seen that under certain circumstances, unrealistic or understood or not understood rather expectations can get in the way of success or perceived success. We have both seen this from different angles, and we'll try and explore this topic so the listeners will have a greater understanding and navigate some path forwards for dealing with their own experiences in their own organizations where appropriate. Hopefully, you will be able to put these into your own context and start working on ways getting the balance right with your own teams as a means of driving better harmony and performance. So on that basis, I'm going to introduce Debbie. So Debbie, where do you think this comes into play?
Well, I think this is a really, really great subject to be talking about, frankly. And I'm hearing this, expectations, problems with expectations coming up over and over again in coaching and in life in general. And I generally think that expectations get us into a lot of trouble.
Okay, so let's clarify a bit more for the benefit of the listeners. What do you mean by an expectation?
Yeah. Well, I've learned that an expectation is something that leads to disappointment. And I see that we have a situation where expectations versus agreements, so that they really play against each other. So either it's we have expectations or we have agreements. So let me just explain that. We have two choices of existing, both at work or at home. And one is through having constant expectations of others and getting frustrated, resenting others, getting stressed, fed up because our expectations are not being met often enough. And the other is having agreement, which we create in a co-creative and a participative way. So expectations, in my experience, both personally and professionally, what they do is they ruin people's chances of a harmonious relationship. And sure, we can't always have agreements on things, but we can increase the number of times that we do. So what I'm saying here is that expectations are toxic. And when leaders have expectations of their people, they walk around thinking things are going to happen according to their thoughts in their head. And they would expect quotas and qualities and quantities and deadlines to be met, which are in fact unrealistic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so can I come back on that, Debbie?
Mm.
I think, I understand the context of what you're saying, but I think what I'm hearing, and again, you can clarify for me, is inappropriate expectations, because some would argue having an expectation in itself is not necessarily a bad thing because it's creating a driving force for change, let's say. But the sense I'm getting from you is more the mismatch on expectations rather than just having an expectation per se.
Yeah, because you can have expectations and nobody know anything about them. And that's what the problem is. So people trying to live up to others' expectations are people that will end up resenting and feeling unreasonably treated. They're not aware of these expectations in the first place. And they'll end up having increased stress, and you'll have a workforce which is ending up with a form of morale and I say morale because I live in France, moral and internal crisis. And I think that's what you can expect if a manager or a leader is driving on expectations that have not been communicated or agreed. The fact is, people don't get up in the morning and look forward to living up to somebody else's expectations. They just don't. Those that do, eventually they'll rebel or just leave.
Okay, so yeah, I'm getting that message very strong around a mismatch, particularly if you're in an organizational relationship. I think what I'd like to do, if that's okay, Debbie, is come back to that. One of the things that we talked about at the start of this discussion is this element of success, right? And the mismatch of expectations and possibly what's meaning by success. So it'd be interesting to hear what's your definition of success? What does it mean in the context here that we're talking about?
Yeah, so success in this context, I believe, is functioning at a high level of agreement and satisfaction, and both coming together. So rather than functioning from a level where expectations are imposed or standards are set without any discussion and deadlines are enforced, what is much more successful way of managing for leaders would be through discussion and agreement. And, you know, human beings by nature love to keep an agreement and see the results of that commitment or promise. And you know, that has been co-created with their leader. It's just normal. So if you sit and you speak, you ask people what they can and can't achieve and what they need in order to achieve even higher productivity or closer deadlines, you'll find out ahead of time why certain things won't happen or wouldn't be possible and why. And then the leader doesn't have to go back about fixing things later and resenting others for not meeting their unrealistic expectations. And this is all fairly simple stuff, but you'd be surprised how many people go around being frequently disappointed in life. And now you can see why.
I'm not surprised at all. I mean, I've seen it not so much in life, but more in business where you've got a hierarchical relationship. I'm getting a sense here, if we go to the business context rather than life, is that there's an element of leadership style here. And I think, and again, I don't want to put words into your mouth, the element of leadership style, because you use the word co-creation, is one of constant balancing, one of constant checking in, lots of micro communications. And I'll come back to this a bit later because I've got a more scientific sort of reflection on what you describe. I totally agree with you, Debbie, but I think that's really, really important that we understand this. And again, at some point in the future, we will be talking about leadership and leadership style in more general. So going back to the question that we've posed at the start of this, how do you see success and expectations really interfering with each other?
Well, first of all, if I can just say that agreement is so much more fun because in fact it's about giving a personal power and creating and being creative together, and I think that's really, really important. It's courageous and it's building because it's participative. It means that people are participating together, and what is more, it's an energy that's contagious in a really incredibly positive way, and it can only lead to higher energy. And you know, we're always talking about energy together, aren't we, John, in it? And I know it's going to come up later in our discussion. So how do they interfere with each other? Well, expectations themselves are reactive. They are of low energy and they are draining and fear-based. And you know, I'm going to use the word cowardly even. Now, why do I say cowardly? Well, think about it. What you do in this mindset of expectations is you create your own false expectations that you have not discussed and you've not agreed on. And then when they are not met, what happens? The blame goes straight onto others and it becomes everybody else's fault. Now, isn't that a cowardly way of going about your business or a relationship? And if you go around always having expectations of others, it always creates, it also creates a sort of a so what kind of culture, a bland and unexciting culture. I love this word that we use in French. We use this one single word, bof, and it means nothing to say. There's no excitement behind it. So what do I mean by that? Either, as I've said, people don't live up to your expectations and you've created a profound disappointment, or if they do live up to it, the results go completely unnoticed. And the attitude is then a neutral one. It's a so what or and it's an empty nothing feeling, boredom, disinterest, and probably some anxiety as well, which ultimately leads to stress and absolutely a toxic culture. So we can go around being disappointed in ourselves and our managers and our heads of departments, supervisors, our bosses, or in the case of at home, a member of the family or son, wife, partners, we're so disappointed. But what does that create? It creates an environment of nothingness, and certainly not a recipe for success.
Now, that's really interesting. And I know, as you say, we'll come back to energy leadership later on, something we both talk about a lot and we're both passionate about. So it's very interesting. I picked up on this point about nothingness, particularly in the bland. It's almost like you hit a place of stasis. And I was thinking a bit about, again, as you know, Debbie, I've got an engineering background as well as a coaching background. I quite often like to build connections between the scientific world and the coaching world. And when I've seen differences, let's say, between expectations, you see a hysteresis, a flexing. If the relationship works well, you can imagine it like a sine wave, right? Where, the expectations start with a wide gap, and over time with the hysteresis, it narrows and you get closer and closer to a point where, the gap between expectations is virtually zero. I don't think you'll ever personally get to a point where there'll be a zero gap, because again, you have to create some sort of driving force, but it has to be close enough that there is this level of mutual respect and authenticity and things that we believe in. And going back to one of the points you made right at the start of this conversation, is that when we have that and we have the sort of higher energy, it's more productive because there's less waste, right? Because when you've got wider and wider gaps, then we're tied up in having unnecessary conversations, right, or meetings or whatever that we don't really need to have. So I find this whole subject, very, very fascinating, and I love the French word bof, as you say, around nothingness. I've never heard that before, but that's really quite interesting, and I'm going to use that. So look, moving on, before we talk about energy leadership together, maybe you'll share some of your real life examples from your work, etc., and I'll do the same, just to provide a bit of extra context for our listeners.
Yeah. Well, I was part of the rolling out of a new branding for a very, very large hotel chain. And I remember very, very well the importance for the MD and the CEOs to communicate at the very early stages and to discuss and reach agreement with some of the hotel managers, because, we had some maverick operating managers in that time. And what we were asking them to do was to mold into a completely different brand, which may not have suited them. And neither did we want to lose them. We wanted them to feel comfortable about the decision that was being made about the branding in the chain. And so getting their agreement on what the standards were going to be, what they could and what they couldn't do in terms of taking bookings, changing rates, changing their standards, when previously they'd been able to do pretty much what they wanted. A key word here was integrity, the integrity of the brand. And that would not have worked had we not reached an agreement with a number of managers. And I remember that, I remember that very, very well.
Yeah, I think the point you make about integrity is well made. And this is one of the key things that we see all the time in life and politics and business. If there is no integrity, there's no authenticity and there's no congruity and no consistency and everything else. So it's really, really important. And I think the start of any change management program or cultural transformation program, setting the expectations around not just what people are going to do, the transactional stuff, but how we behave, our levels of honesty, and integrity are really, really important.
Yeah.
And I know from my own experience, and I've done a lot of consulting in different cultures, both in the Middle East and in Russia. And I remember one particular situation where there was a misalignment of cultures, and also between leaders and employees in terms of what type of work, it was like a huge gap was expected. And certain cultures, they're very detail oriented. And I've seen situations where almost the point where people, I used to call it the detail monster, they got so obsessed with detail, they start to drive themselves into the ground and nothing will get done. In that case, expectations hadn't been set clear in terms of actually the level of detail required, because in a management process change, the level of detail is not the same as required in, say, a medical instrument, for instance, or a critical safety component on an aeroplane. And I remember myself having to do a whole workshop on the 80-20 rule so people could understand that, that the hurdles required in these different processes were totally different. And that's just a classic case of expectations. And effectively, the people started to send themselves down rabbit holes, which again is, a total waste of time and energy. So I think the one big learning for me in those experiences, and I spend a lot of time looking at culture, particularly in foreign companies and foreign cultures. I'm a big fan of Geert Hofstede and his 6 cultural dimensions, is thinking very strongly about where the cultural gaps could be as a means of narrowing that gap between, expectations between leaders and staff. And that way, there's a greater chance of getting some, success. I think just one final thought on this, Debbie, if that's okay, before we get on to energy leadership, is I think, we've talked about it being incumbent on the managers to actually make sure that they get their expectations right of their staff. But it is a two-way street. And it's important that the staff also are very clear. And if they believe that there is a mismatch in expectations, that they, assuming the culture allows it, of course, is they shout up, right? We all have a responsibility to close the gap. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I absolutely remember another example when I was sent to Doncaster as a banqueting manager, and I had 3 functions on the same day, on a Saturday. And I remember distinctly that if I had not talked to specific people in my teams, I would have had some real big problems of overlap, because we simply didn't have the equipment to supply for 3 functions. And they knew that, because they came in and count plates and count cutlery and so on, which of course I didn't do. So again, getting their agreement on what happened when, and that there was no overlap on certain stages was crucial. And that's where, getting the agreement discussion with the staff was very, very, very important.
Yes, Debbie, that's very powerful. I think we've had quite a rich discussion around that. And this is our opportunity to possibly introduce just today, not to go into any detail, one of the topics that you and I are both passionate about, which is this concept of energy leadership, how, this whole energy serves us, it improves our performance, and depending on what energy levels we have at any particular time, and of course they can change, will determine how we behave, how we act, how we interact. And of course, a toxic environment, which potentially could be created by a mismanagement of expectations over time, would actually inevitably lower people's energy to a point where, they may become apathetic, for instance, or feel as though they're being a victim. We're not necessarily going to go into this in detail today, but it is a really, really powerful thought and process and approach that we use. And we just wanted to raise the awareness of the listeners on that. Any thoughts to build on that, Debbie?
I think, I live and breathe energy leadership, and when you are working with a co-creative style of management, you are getting everybody involved. And that, in our language, and energy leaders language, is very much a level 5, where we all play together, or we all win or we don't play. So that's where I would be coming from there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is. It's all about winning, as you say, with the win-win culture and for mutual betterment. And that's the key thing here, isn't it? It's mutual betterment, right? If it's lopsided, which goes back to the whole point of expectation mismanagement, then it's not going to get, to mutual betterment. We're going to be talking about this in a lot more detail as we go into our other leadership series, but you can certainly find research papers done on websites, on TCB, on our personal coaching websites. You'll see some links there. There's a lot of research that backs this up. So a very, very powerful topic and a good lead in, I think, to other things that we're going to discuss. So thanks, Debbie, for being on this podcast today. And thanks to everybody for listening. I hope you enjoyed our insights and you'll listen to the next one in the series. Please, if you can, take a look at the team coaching website, YouTube channels, and our aim is to have a positive impact on the environment. That's one of the reasons why we do this. And, also get people involved in the work of performance and the whole area of team dynamics. And if you really want to as well, please follow us on Instagram and our LinkedIn pages and connect with us as well individually on LinkedIn. So thanks again, Debbie.
Thank you.